Please remain seated and come to order. Department 24 is back in session.
Thank you, folks. For scheduling purposes, we'll be taking lunch at noon, and the doors will open back up at 1 o'clock. And we'll try to get promptly started at 1:15. We're back in session. Let the record reflect all councils present, as well as Mr. DeAngelo. The people are present as well. Proceed, I believe. Can I have the representative from Contra Costa County come forward and please state your name for the record?
Good afternoon, Your Honor, or good morning still, excuse me. Venus Johnson from Contra Costa County. Thank you. Your Honor, I will be proceeding 23. On or about October 7th of 1978, in the city of Concord and the county of Contra Costa, Jane Doe number 10 and her husband, John Doe number 9, went to bed at approximately 11:30 p.m. John Doe 9 recalled being awoken by a sound and seeing a male standing at the foot of his bed. That male was the defendant, Joseph DeAngelo. DeAngelo was holding a flashlight in his left hand and pointing a revolver at John Doe number 9, which was held in his right. The defendant then said, quote, "I just want food and money, that's all. I'll kill you if you don't do what I say." Jane Doe number 10 woke up at this point, and the defendant told her husband to turn over and put his hands behind his back. He then threw several shoestrings at Jane Doe and told her to tie up her husband. She wasn't moving fast enough for his liking, so the defendant took over and finished the job. The defendant then went into their closet and retrieved more shoestrings from the shoes that he found. He then used those shoestrings to tie up Jane Doe's hands and her feet while pointing a knife at her throat and saying, quote, "I'll kill you if you don't do everything I say." He then told Jane Doe and her husband to remain lying face down and stated, quote, "If you see me, I'll have to kill you." The defendant then began going through dresser drawers, jewelry boxes, and their respective wallet and purse. He continued to rummage through the house for another half hour, returning to the bedroom. He had taken dishes from the kitchen and placed those dishes on top of both of their backs as they lie face down in the bed. He left the room again and continued to rummage through the house. He returned back to the bedroom and cut the shoestring around Jane Doe number 10's feet. He told her to stand up and said, quote, "Don't you look at me or I'll cut your fucking head off." He then had her walk in front of him while holding the knife at her left side, at the left side of her throat, and continued to threaten her that if she did not do what he said, that he would kill her and everyone in the house, which included their baby boy who was asleep in another room. He then walked her to the family room where he blindfolded her and told her to lie face down. He returned to the bedroom to place more dishes on her husband's body and told him, quote, "If these dishes fall, I'll kill everyone in the house." The defendant unlawfully kidnapped and forced Jane Doe at knife point out of her bedroom and into the family room with the intent to commit robbery within the meaning of Penal Code Section 209 and used a knife to do so. With her arms still tied behind her back and her husband still bound by his hands and his feet, lying face down in their bedroom with dishes stacked on top of his body, the defendant's decision to move her was more than merely incidental, as it substantially increased the risk of harm to her above and beyond the crime of robbery itself. This movement fundamentally changed her environment and moved her out of the sight of her husband and into a completely different part of the house and increased the possibility of further crimes being committed against her. Once in the family room, the defendant told the victim, and again, pardon my language, Your Honor, I'm reading direct quotes, quote, "If you don't give me a good fuck, I'll kill everyone," end quote. He then cut her nightgown in several places with a knife and proceeded to rape her, penetrating her vagina and her anus with his penis. He then forced her to orally copulate him by threatening to cut her baby boy's ear off and bringing it to her if she resisted. The defendant then continued to rummage through the house, continued to check on John Doe, has been threatening that he would kill everyone in the house if he moved. He continued to tell both Jane Doe and her husband that he wanted gold and silver. He continued rummaging through the house for some time until he finally left and never returned. Numerous pieces of jewelry and money were taken that night. The defendant was described as wearing a face mask with the eyes and the mouth cut out and brushed suede gloves.
Thank you. Defense wish to be heard as to count 23. Mr. DeAngelo, regarding count 23 and the charge of offense of kidnapping with intent to commit robbery of Jane Doe 10, having occurred on November 7th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 209. How do you plead?
Guilty.
There's also an allegation that you personally used a firearm in the course of that robbery, a violation of Penal Code Section 12022.5 of the Penal Code. Do you admit or deny that enhancement?
I admit.
There's also an allegation that you personally used a knife in the course of that robbery, violation of Penal Code Section 12022. Do you admit or deny that, sir?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged act of rape of Jane Doe 10 having occurred on November 7th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 261, do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of robbery of Jane Doe 10 and John Doe 9 having occurred on November 7th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 211, do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of false imprisonment of Jane Doe 10 and John Doe 9 having occurred November 7th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 236, do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged act of making a criminal threat to Jane Doe 10 and John Doe 9 having occurred November 7th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 422. Do you admit or deny, sir?
I admit.
Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. If I may, if it pleases the court for count 23, the correct date, Your Honor, I believe should be October 7th, 1978, and not November 7th of 1978.
Thank you. With that understanding, does the defense wish to be heard as to the date?
No, Your Honor.
All right, very good. Thank you. Go ahead, counsel. Thank you for that correction.
Thank you, Your Honor. The following is a factual basis for count 24. On or about October 13th of 1978 in the city of Concord in the county of Contra Costa at approximately 4:30 a.m., Jane Doe number 11 and her roommate and significant other, John Doe number 10, were awoken by their room door being swung open and a flashlight illuminating their room. The male shouted for them not to move or he would kill them. The male, Joseph DeAngelo, then directed John Doe number 10 to lie face down and threw shoestrings at Jane Doe 11, directing her to tie him up. She complied. He then told her to lie face down, and he tied her hands and legs, and John Doe number 10's legs as well. At this point, Jane Doe's daughter came running in to the bedroom at her mother's side, screaming. The defendant directed Jane Doe to shut her daughter up or he would kill them all. The defendant subsequently put the daughter in a bathroom, pushing a dresser in front of the door to prevent her from escaping. After approximately 30 minutes of listening to the defendant rummage through their home, where he intermediately checked on the bindings of both victims and ordered them to stay where they were, the defendant returned to the bedroom, dragging Jane Doe 11 from the bedroom down their hallway to the family room. The defendant unlawfully kidnapped and carried the victim down the hall and away from her bedroom with the intent to commit robbery within the meaning of Penal Code Section 209 and used a gun to do so. With the victim still bound at the hands and feet, her significant other still bound by his hands and feet in their bedroom, the defendant's decision to move her was more than merely incidental, as it substantially increased the risk of harm to her above and beyond the crime of robbery itself. This movement fundamentally changed her environment and moved her out of the sight of her roommate and significant other into a completely different part of the house and increased the possibility of further crimes being committed against her. Once in the family room, the defendant covered Jane Doe's face with towels. He unbound her legs and he raped her, unlawfully penetrating her vagina with his penis. At some point during this time, he returned to the bedroom and put what felt like the barrel of a gun to the back of John Doe number 10's neck and said, quote, "All we want is food and money, and then we'll get the hell out of here." He then covered John Doe's head with an Afghan and threatened to put, quote, "this knife in his back if he moved." The defendant left and returned to the room a number of times over the next 45 minutes. The defendant eventually left the residence through a garage door. He was described as wearing a dark face mask and brown leather gloves. Jane Doe number 11 noticed that $8 had been taken from her purse that was in the kitchen, a Sears radio clock, and 2 cartons of cigarettes, both of which were in the kitchen as well. After further inventory of the home, it was discovered that the defendant had taken 3 bottles of Budweiser from the refrigerator and a wooden bowl from their cupboard.
Thank you. Does defense counsel wish to be heard as the factual basis?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Regarding count 24 and the charge of offensive kidnapping with intent to commit robbery of Jane Doe 11 having occurred on October 13th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, violation of Penal Code Section 209. How do you plead, sir?
Guilty.
There's also an allegation that you personally used a firearm in the course of that robbery, violation of Penal Code Section 12022.5. Do you admit or deny that allegation?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of rape of Jane Doe 11 having occurred on October 13th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, violation of Penal Code Section 261. You admit or deny, sir?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of robbery of Jane Doe 11 and John Doe 10 having occurred October 13th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, violation of Penal Code Section 211, you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of false imprisonment of Jane Doe 11 and John Doe 10 having occurred October 13th, 1978 in the county of Contra Costa, violation of Penal Code Section 236, you admit or deny?
I admit.
And regarding the uncharged offense of making a criminal threat, Jane Doe 10 and John Doe 9 having occurred October 13th, 1978, we'll strike that, Jane Doe 11 and John Doe 10 having occurred on October 13th in Contra Costa County, a violation of Penal Code Section 422. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. The following is a factual basis for count 25. On or about October 28th of 1978, Jane Doe number 12 and her husband, John Doe number 11, were in their bedroom asleep when she was awoken by the defendant, standing in her bedroom, shining a small pin-like flashlight in her face. He instructed her not to say a thing or he would kill her. He then instructed her to wake up her husband. She did as she was told and was given 2 pieces of rope from the defendant to tie her husband's hand behind his back. Joseph DeAngelo then tied her husband's feet, her hands behind her back, and then tied her feet together as well. They were both left face down on the bed. The defendant then asked both of them several times where the money was. Jane Doe number 12 told him that she had about $50 in her purse and directed him to some coins in a closet. The defendant responded several times that he would need more than that. The defendant then went through the house for about 15 minutes and repeatedly told them not to move or he would kill them. The defendant then went to the bedroom and cut Jane Doe 12's legs free and whispered to her, quote, "Get out of bed. I want you away from him so you can't untie him." She managed to get out of the bed and the defendant pushed her down the hall. They got to the kitchen where he pushed her onto the floor and she lay on her stomach. Joseph DeAngelo unlawfully kidnapped and carried the victim away with the intent to commit robbery within the meaning of Penal Code Section 209, with the victim still bound at the hands and her husband still bound by his hands and feet in their bedroom. Joseph DeAngelo's decision to move her was more than merely incidental, as it substantially increased the risk of harm to her above and beyond the crime of robbery itself. This movement fundamentally changed her environment and moved her out of the sight of her husband into a completely different part of the house, increasing the possibility of further crimes being committed against her. The defendant continued to wander through the house and asked Jane Doe where the money was. He then tied her feet back together at some point. He ultimately returned to the kitchen and blindfolded her with a towel and then turned the light on above the stove where she was lying on the floor in the kitchen. He left again to wander through the house. The victim's husband noticed that the defendant had returned to the bedroom at some point and put what felt like a gun to the back of his head and told him if he moved, he would kill him. The defendant then returned to the kitchen and pushed what felt like the blade of a knife against Jane Doe's throat and threatened that if she made a move, he would kill her. He subsequently forced her to orally copulate him, threatening to kill her if she refused. During the course of the robbery, the defendant also unlawfully and without consent penetrated the victim's vagina with his penis, raping her as she lay on the kitchen floor. He then forced her to orally copulate him again, threatening again to kill her. He ejaculated into her mouth and on the side of her face. Continued wandering through the house and made his way back into the kitchen where he again raped the victim a second time as she lay on the kitchen floor. At some point, he noticed the ring on her finger, which he subsequently took off of her hand. He eventually left after the victim warned him that she was expecting a car service to pick her up early that morning, and the car would be there any minute. The The defendant was described as having worn tan gloves and possibly having a mask on of some sort covering his face, and a total of $64 was taken along with 2 female rings. A sexual assault evidence kit was collected from the victim. A vaginal sample was analyzed for DNA. The DNA profile from the sperm fraction of the vaginal swab generated a single male donor, consistent with the single male donor from charged count 26, Jane Doe number 13, and from uncharged count 70, Jane Doe number 47, both of which are Contra Costa cases, in addition to the Orange County, Ventura, and Santa Barbara cases as well. In May of 2018, the California Department of Justice notified Contra Costa Sheriff's Department Crime Laboratory of a DNA match to defendant Joseph DeAngelo.
Thank you, counsel. Defense counsel wish to be heard of the factual basis on count 25?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. Regarding count 25, the charge of offense of kidnapping with intent to commit robbery of Jane Doe 12, having occurred on October 28, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, violation to Penal Code Section 209. How do you plead?
Guilty.
There's also an allegation that you personally used a firearm in the course of that robbery, a violation of Penal Code Section 12022.5. Do you admit or deny that, sir?
I admit.
There's also an allegation that you personally used a knife in the course of that robbery in violation of Penal Code Section 12022. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of rape of Jane Doe 12, having occurred on October 28, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 261. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of robbery of Jane Doe 12 and John Doe 11, having occurred October 28, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 211. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of false imprisonment of Jane Doe 12 and John Doe 11, having occurred on October 28, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 236. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of making criminal threats to Jane Doe 12 and John Doe 11, having occurred October 28, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 422. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. The following is factual basis for count 26. On or about June 11th of 1979 in the city of Danville in the county of Contra Costa, at approximately 4 a.m., the victim, Jane Doe number 13, woke up feeling the presence of someone in her bedroom. She saw a male wearing a face mask with eyes and the mouth cut out and also wearing gloves. That male was the defendant, Joseph DeAngelo. The defendant then said to her, quote, "Don't move, all I want is your money." He then told her to wake her husband, John Doe number 12, and directed both of them to roll over face down on the bed. He then told Jane Doe number 13 to tie up her husband, which she did. He then tied her up and gagged her and blindfolded her and carried her to the front room of the home and laid her face down on the floor. The defendant unlawfully kidnapped and carried the victim away with the intent to commit robbery within the meaning of Penal Code Section 209, with the victim still bound, blindfolded, and gagged, and her husband's still bound by his hands and feet, lying face down in their bedroom. The defendant's decision to physically carry her, pick her up, was more than merely incidental, as it substantially increased the risk of harm to her above and beyond the crime of robbery itself. This movement fundamentally changed her environment and moved her out of the sight of her husband into a completely different part of the house and increased the possibility of further crimes being committed against her. While in the front room, the defendant untied her ankles and forcibly raped her, unlawfully penetrating her vagina with his penis. He then wrapped 2 towels around her head and retied her ankles. He continued rummaging through their kitchen and took beer cans out of their refrigerator. He subsequently left the home, having taken approximately $55, a diamond ring, and 1 wedding band. A sexual assault evidence kit was collected from the victim. A vaginal sample was analyzed for DNA. The DNA profile from the sperm fraction of the vaginal swab generated a single male donor, consistent with the single male donor from charged count 25, Jane Doe number 12, and from uncharged count 70, Jane Doe number 47, both of which are Contra Costa cases, in addition to the Orange County, Ventura, and Santa Barbara cases. In May of 2018, the California Department of Justice notified Contra Costa Sheriff's Department Crime Laboratory of a DNA match to the defendant, Joseph DeAngelo.
Thank you, counsel. Defense counsel wish to be heard as the factual basis on count 26.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. DeAngelo. Regarding count 26 and the charge of offense of kidnapping with intent to commit robbery of Jane Doe 13, having occurred on June 11th, 1979, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 209. How do you plead, sir?
Guilty.
There's also an allegation that you personally used a firearm in the course of that robbery, violation of Penal Code Section 12022.5 of the Penal Code. You admit or deny that?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of rape of Jane Doe 13, having occurred on June 11th, 1979, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 261, do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of robbery of Jane Doe 13 and John Doe 12, having occurred June 11th, 1979, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 211, do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of false imprisonment of Jane Doe 13 and John Doe 12, having occurred June 11th, 1979, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 236. Do you admit or deny that, sir?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of making a criminal threat to Jane Doe 13 and John Doe 12, having occurred on June 11th, 1979, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 422. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. The following is a factual basis for count 70. On or about December 9th of 1978, Jane Doe number 47 was home alone. She lived in the city of Danville in the county of Contra Costa. She had gone to bed around 12:30 a.m. that morning, normally slept on her stomach. She was awoken out of her sleep by the touch of a male's hand on the nape of her neck. The male was Joseph DeAngelo. Still holding her head down, he also held a long, blunt-tipped object perpendicular to her throat and said, quote, "Don't scream. Don't make a noise. I won't hurt you. All I want is money and food for my van." He continued, "Where's the money? Where's the money?" He then told her to put her hands behind her back, which she did. He then pulled the covers off of her and told her to put her hands up high enough behind her back, which she did. He then tied her hands behind her back and pulled the bed covers over her head. He then pulled the bed covers up from the bottom, exposing her feet, and told her to cross them, which she did. He then tied her feet together and left the bedroom. Victim could hear him in her kitchen, opening and closing cupboards and opening and closing doors in the hallway. He then entered her room again and began opening and closing drawers. She saw what she thought was a light from a flashlight at this point, and her head still covered with the sheets. He continued rummaging through the house and at some point turned off the radio in the living room and the heater, both of which she had left on before she went to bed. He then returned to her room once more, this time to her bedside. She heard something tearing. 2 strips of cloth were then placed over her eyes. At that point, what she heard next was the defendant masturbating at her bedside. He then walked into her bathroom and returned, continuing to masturbate. At this point, she smelled what she believed was the odor of her lotion from her bathroom. He then untied her legs, turned her over, and pushed one of her legs up toward the headboard of the bed. He pulled her shirt up, and using her name, quote, said, "Do you like to fuck?" To which she said no. She also remembered him asking again, "Where's the money? Where's the money?" The latter of which she responded. There was money in her purse, which was in the kitchen. He continued on at her bedside, quote, "Do you like to raise dicks?" To which she replied, "No." In return, he said, quote, "Then how come you always raise mine every time I see you?" The victim didn't respond. He then raised her shirt up and fondled her breasts. He went down toward the edge of the bed, raised her legs so that both knees were bent. He then penetrated her vagina without her consent with his penis, moving his penis from her vagina to her rectum and back and forth again. He then retied her feet, covered her again with the bedding, and left the room. Came back, though, turned her on her right side, and moved her left leg up toward her upper body. He then inserted his penis into her vagina without her consent and raped her again. Once the act was complete, he got up, rubbed his hands on his sheet, retied her feet, and left the room. She then heard a screen door open and waited for the defendant to leave. After waiting for a period of time, she began to try and untie herself. She was able to get to the kitchen to retrieve a knife to cut the ties, and at that point, she noticed that it was about 5 a.m. She went to a neighbor's house for help. She was taken later that morning to the emergency room at John Muir Hospital for a sexual assault examination. After a search of her home, it was discovered that money, approximately $25, and her driver's license were taken from her wallet. Additionally, 5 pieces of jewelry were missing, which had been taken from the jewelry box. A yellow gold ring with a jade stone, a yellow gold ring with an aquamarine stone, a yellow gold stick pin with an opal stone, a white gold pendant with an opal stone and 2 small diamonds with a gold chain, and a yellow gold antique pendant with a pink stone with seed pearls and a yellow gold chain. The defendant had also taken a bottle of beer from her refrigerator, consumed it, and left it in the rear of her yard. A sexual assault evidence kit was collected from the victim. A vaginal sample was analyzed for DNA. The DNA profile from the sperm fraction of the vaginal swab generated a single male donor, consistent with the single male donor from charge count 25, Jane Doe number 12, and charge count number 26, Jane Doe number 13, both of which are Contra Costa cases, in addition to the Orange County, Ventura, and Santa Barbara cases. In May of 2018, the California Department of Justice notified Contra Costa Sheriff's Department Crime Laboratory of a DNA match to the defendant, Joseph DeAngelo.
Thank you. Does defense counsel wish to be heard as to incident 70?
No, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. DeAngelo, regarding the uncharged offense of rape of Jane Doe 47 having occurred on December 9th, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 261. Do you admit or deny that, sir?
I admit.
regarding the uncharged offense of false imprisonment of Jane Doe, 47, having occurred on December 9th, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 236. Do you admit or deny that?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of making a criminal threat to Jane Doe, 47, having occurred on December 9th, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 422. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. Following is a factual basis for count 71. On June 2nd of 1979, in the city of Walnut Creek, in the county of Contra Costa, Jane Doe number 48 was babysitting for a family in a single-story residence. At approximately 8:30 p.m., she was sitting at the kitchen table, and she heard either footsteps or a voice that caused her to look toward the hallway. She saw a male standing there with a white face mask on, holding a large leather sheath, which she believed contained a knife. The man standing in the hallway was Joseph DeAngelo. He said to her, quote, "Shut up, don't make a noise." He immediately grabbed her and pushed her head down to a point where she could not look up at him. He then walked her from the kitchen to the master bedroom and laid her face down on the bed. He directed her to put her hands behind her back and to hold still as he bound her wrists and ankles with plastic ties. He then covered her eyes with a halter top, placed a towel around her mouth, and gagged her with the towel. As she lay face down on the bed, he began rummaging through the bedroom and told her to be still or he would kill her. She believed that there was a flashlight in his hand at this time. He then turned her over on her back, her hand still bound and positioned underneath her back. He took her shoes and socks off. He untied the bindings around her ankles and got on top of her. He then took his own pants off and began masturbating. He then either spread her legs or told her to spread them and attempted to penetrate her vagina with his penis. At this point, he asked her, quote, "Have you ever fucked before?" He then got frustrated and stopped. The defendant then got up and began rummaging through the room again, still blindfolded. The victim felt something moist in her hands. The defendant moved to her left side of the bed and placed his penis in her hands and told her to stroke and play with his penis and to masturbate him. He then reached under her shirt, ripped up her bra, pulled up her shirt, and bit her left breast 4 times. One of those times biting down extremely hard. He then penetrated her vagina with his penis without her consent and raped her. He continued to tell her not to make a sound, stroked the left side of her neck with the sheath-like object, which again she believed to be a large knife within that sheath. He then told her not to move or he would cut her throat. He continued to rape her until he eventually stood up and bound her ankles once more. He rummaged through the room for a short time and left through the sliding glass door at the rear of the residence. She eventually was able to work her ankles free, believing it to be around 11:15 or 11:20 p.m. at that time. She awoke one of the children she was babysitting, was eventually able to get someone to contact her parents and the Walnut Creek Police Department.
Thank you, counsel. For the defense, you wish to be heard as to incident 71.
No, Your Honor.
Regarding the uncharged offense of rape of Jane Doe, 48, having occurred on June 2nd, 1979, in the county of Contra Costa, violation of Penal Code Section 261. Do you admit or deny that?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of false imprisonment of Jane Doe, 48, having occurred on June 2nd, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 236, do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of making a criminal threat to Jane Doe, 48, having occurred June 2nd, 1978, in the county of Contra Costa, A violation of Penal Code Section 422. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. The following is a factual basis for count 72. On June 25th of 1979, in the city of Walnut Creek in the county of Contra Costa, the victim was home with her sister and father, Jane Doe, number 49. She and her sister went to bed at around 9:30 or 10 o'clock p.m., and her father had gone to bed a little later, around 11, all in their own respective bedrooms. It was customary for everyone to sleep with their bedroom doors closed. The victim indicated that she did sleep with her window open that evening. She wore a full-length nightgown to bed and cotton underwear. At some point in the middle of the night, a man jumped on her back. She was asleep in her bed. He put his hand over her mouth and said, quote, "Don't say a word. I'm not going to kill you. All I'm looking for is money. All I want is money." She could feel the sharp point of the knife being put to the side of her neck. He pulled her comforter back and told her to place her hands behind her back. She complied. She could feel her hands being tied tightly with some type of twine or rope. He then got off of her bed and covered her entire body, including her head, with the comforter. At some point during the sequence of events, her feet were tied together as well. At this point, she turned to see the male, Joseph DeAngelo, the defendant, in her bedroom. She observed his clothing and could see that he had a light-colored mask over his head. At that point, she was left alone for a few minutes as he rummaged through her bedroom. She was threatened again not to say a word. He then returned to her bed after about 5 minutes with a piece of cloth material and forced it into her mouth, and then tied a bra around her head and also obtained a pair of underwear from her underwear drawer and tied those behind her head. She was not blindfolded at this point. The defendant commanded her to keep her head down and not to look at him. He continued to say that he was looking for money, and at this point, she saw what she believed to be a flashlight. After seeing momentary flashes of light in her room, he then found a table lamp in the room and turned it on and continued to rummage around her room and said, calling her out by name, "Just do what I want and I won't hurt you." She then heard what sounded like someone applying baby lotion or hand lotion either to their hands or some portion of their body. Defendant returned to her bed, straddled her body, and placed his penis in her hands, which were still tied behind her back, and told her, quote, "You rub my cock and you better make it good or I'll kill you." She did as she was told. He then directed her to turn over on her back and she complied. He removed the ties from her feet and reached under her nightgown, pulling her underwear down, and asked her something to the effect of, in a direct quote, had she fucked or done this before? At this point, her face was covered by a shirt that the defendant had put over her face and gave her the following command: "I want you to spread your legs apart." She complied. He got on his knees and maneuvered her legs on each side of his body and then penetrated her vagina without her consent with his penis and raped her. He continued thrusting against her body and then eventually pulled his penis out. He then retied her feet together, her hands still bound behind her, still gagged, face still covered with the shirt. He then put his mouth close to her ear and said, quote, "I'll kill you while I'm looking for money, money, money." He then left her bedroom, closing the door behind him. She waited for about 15 minutes until she believed the defendant was gone and went to her father's room screaming on the way there, "I was raped." The police soon arrived and she was ultimately taken to John Muir Hospital with her sister and mother for a sexual assault examination.
Thank you, counsel. Defense counsel wish to be heard as to incident 72.
No, Your Honor.
Mr. DeAngelo, regarding the uncharged offense of rape of Jane Doe, 49, having occurred on June 25th, 1979 in the county of Contra Costa, violation of Penal Code Section 261, do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged offense of false imprisonment of Jane Doe, 49, having occurred on June 25th, 1979, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 236. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
And regarding the uncharged offense of making a criminal threat to Jane Doe, 49, having occurred on June 25th, 1979, in the county of Contra Costa, a violation of Penal Code Section 422. Do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Court finds that Mr. DeAngelo has made a knowing, voluntary, and intelligent waiver of his rights to a jury trial, to confrontation, and against self-incrimination. Court further finds a plea was made voluntarily and with the understanding of the nature of the charges pending, as well as the consequences of this plea. Court does find a factual basis for the plea and the admissions. Do the people accept the plea and the conditions stated on the record?
Yes, Your Honor.
Court accepts the plea and the conditions stated on the record, and based on the plea of guilty and the admission, the court finds count 23 does find Mr. DeAngelo guilty of the crime of kidnapping with intent to commit robbery, violation of Penal Code Section 209. Court further finds that Mr. DeAngelo did personally use a firearm in the course of that kidnapping to commit robbery, a violation of Penal Code Section 12022.5. Find that to be true based on his admission. Court further finds that there was a personal use of a knife, violation of Penal Code Section 12022 based on his admission. Count 24. Court finds that Mr. DeAngelo is guilty. Count 24, violation of Penal Code Section 209, kidnapping with intent to commit robbery. Court further finds violation of Penal Code Section 12022.5, a personal use of firearm. 1 second, please. As to alleged count 25, court finds Mr. DeAngelo guilty, violation of Penal Code Section 209, kidnapping with intent to commit robbery. Court also finds violation that he did personally use a firearm in violation of Penal Code Section 12022.5 to be true based on his admission. Court further finds a personal use of a knife, violation Penal Code Section 12022. Find that to be true based on his admission. Count 26, court finds Mr. DeAngelo guilty, violation Penal Code Section 209, kidnapping with intent to commit robbery. Also finds that Mr. DeAngelo did use a firearm or personal use of a firearm in violation of Penal Code Section 1222.5. Find that to be true based on his admission. The people waive referral of this matter to Probation Department for a formal report pursuant to Penal Code Section 1203, Paren B, Paren 4, and in its place request a 1203C report.
We do, Your Honor.
Do the defense likewise waive?
Yes, Your Honor.
Anything else from either counsel?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. We're going to take our lunch recess and we'll proceed with Orange County when we come back. Thank you, and recess.